Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. With the recent death of Jerry Lee Lewis, the world said farewell to the previously last surviving member of the great rock and roll legends of the 1950s, a group of visionary artists who in a very short time span made an indelible mark on not just American, but overall music history, with the mainlining into the mainstream of this mongrel hybrid beast of a musical invention called rock and roll. In light of Lewis's death, it seems only fitting that the Curmudgeon Rock Report take a big step back into the decade that birthed our beloved rock music and analyze its origins, musically, culturally, geographically, and chronologically, as well as analyze the artists, singers, songwriters, producers, and overall movers and shakers who brought this distinct African-American music from the American South and infiltrated white America, set the world on fire, and altered the course of popular music forever. Earlier this year, we produced our epic series, The Fourth Golden Age of Rock, which covered rock music in the 1990s, the decade where the genre made its last stand as a mainstream pop cultural force. Well, that implies that there are three other golden ages, and that also important first golden age, the period roughly covering 1954 to 59, will finally get its due coverage in this two-part series, the first of which you are listening to now. So, grab some pomade and slick up your hair, swivel those hips, practice your duck walk, and get ready to dance at that sock hop where there's a whole lot of shaking going on and where the Curmudgeon Rock Report will bring you the first golden age of rock.
Don't care to hear 'em play a sambo, ain't too much of that Congo, not in the mood to take a mambo, so keep a rockin' that piano. So Art, are you ready to boogie woogie through the origins of rock and roll on this episode?
That's a Chuck Berry song, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
That is from Rock and Roll Music, which is one of the better songs ever written about rock and roll.
Right.
And so, yeah, this is an exciting episode for me because, I mean, I'm just absolutely fascinated by what we're calling the first golden age of rock. I mean, just because it's basically a roll up of everything that was parochial. If you go across the Appalachians, you go down the Mississippi River and then down into Texas and New Orleans and then points east. Yeah. If it was parochial, it got soaked up as part of rock and roll. So rock and roll is like the sum of all parochials.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, it was, for a good 30 years, it was the most dominant pop cultural music form in the U.S. and in most of the world,
Yeah.
Until hip-hop came along.
Yeah, but which kind of came along in the same spirit,
Right.
And, very parochial. And then, just sort of, you have your pioneers and there's a whole bunch of hybrids and all of that. So, rock and roll keeps repeating itself, just not as, orthodox rock and roll. But no, so this will be exciting. We get to go over some really great stuff and some really interesting characters.
Yeah.
Really, really, really interesting characters. Yes. And not just Little Richard.
So. Chuck Berry's got some stuff in his closet as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, they all do. I mean, poor Fats Domino, he was just too normal,
I
yeah,
know.
if he was less normal, we'd be talking more about him,
Right. Right.
Yeah. So anyway, so what else is going on with you, man?
No, good, good. I'm ready to get in the rock and roll time machine to the 1950s, get to that sock hop, and grease my hair back and do all that 50s shit, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Although, just remember, we're starting with that 20s, 30s, and 40s shit to get
Yes,
to that
sure.
50s shit. So,
Sure, sure.
very, very deconstructive episode. Speaking of deconstruction, you know that there's such a thing as deconstruction in the parallel universe
There is.
because you just can't get to the parallel universe without some kind of deconstruction, namely the destruction of the space-time continuum, which
Right.
allows us to get into the parallel universe.
Right.
And, longtime listeners of this podcast, the Curmudgeon Rock Report, know that we do this foray where we go into the parallel universe where blue is green and up is down, and the great stuff is still the great stuff, and the bad stuff is still the bad stuff. The things that we feel should be in the arenas and the stadiums and on the cover of Rolling Stone are there, and all is right with the world and just. So basically, that's just a long way of saying that we just cover modern albums. On that note, Arturo, what are you covering this week here in Parallel Universe Land?
Oh yeah. If you are into 1990s techno and overall 1990s EDM like I am, then the duo Belief and their self-titled debut album is the jam for you. Producer Brian Holland and Stella Mozgawa, the latter being the drummer for the indie rock band Warpaint, they have brought forth this wonderful slice of retro techno and ambient house that, while definitely hearkening to the past, it also sounds startlingly fresh, especially compared to a lot of the bland, monotonous, droning, overly mellow electronica that's in fashion now. They have the shifting textures of early Autiker before Autiker got all glitchy and atonal. They have the warmth of Boards of Canada, and they have the subtly driving, pulsing rhythms of the Orb in their from their peak early 1990s period. For those of you out there who listen to songs and not albums and like to use streaming services like Spotify, YouTube Plus, and all that other stuff, tracks to check out: Dreams, Watt, W-O-T, Watt, and the beautifully lyrical Ulu. No, it isn't the most original album you'll hear this year, but it's one of the grooviest and most endearingly charming.
To me, and I think you hit the nail on the head with this one, is that there's a lot of this sort of loungy chill thing that a lot of folks try to approach. And it like you said, it's monotonous and it's kind of icky, or in some cases, like a little just sort of overly dramatic. So it's kind of nice to get this retro yet kind of modern, chill kind of record. Again, that evokes the Orb and some of that stuff that you got back there. Good call on Autiker as well.
Yeah.
Still reminds me of one of my favorite lines from a critic ever, where John Pareles calls the Radiohead song "You Might Be Wrong" Autiker as rendered by ZZ Top. Yeah. So anyway, definitely check out Belief, folks. So we're going to shift a little bit there. This isn't house, but it also is something that I think you can consider retro for sure. This is by a young band called Anxious, and their album Little Green House, which is surprisingly really, really good considering. So, Art, you and I know Southern Connecticut pretty well, right?
Yeah, I lived there for a while.
Yeah, you lived in Stamford for a while. I have roots up the block in Waterbury, and I've spent a lot of time in those New York City suburbs in the Connecticut side there, and Bridgeport and Danbury and Waterbury. And I mean, I practically, would spend my summers there. But anyway, so, wouldn't you know that pop punk or emo or post-hardcore or whatever you want to call it, or hey, maybe just all three, are alive and well there in our beloved Nutmeg State. That kind of sounds ridiculous, And when you see publicity photos of the band Anxious, it actually kind of looks ridiculous because essentially it's like four dorks and like a dude with the most rock star hair and smoldering eyes ever. It's a strange sight. Now, more on that kid here in a bit, and some disclosure. So, 20-something years ago, I had an editor at an outfit called SonicNet, which was bought up by MTV when I was there. A guy named Matt Malucci, good dude. He also has some Connecticut roots. He worked for the Waterbury paper and also a Syracuse grad. Well, his son Dante, this is his band. And no, that's not the reason I'm covering them. But it just so happens that Dante is uber talented. I mean, he actually, when School of Rock became a Broadway musical, he was in the original cast as the drummer for the band, and so he had that kind of talent. Well, it turns out it's not all just Broadway and drums. It turns out he's pretty good emo guitar guy as well. So really, that said, I mean, just trust me when I say that Anxious actually is anything but ridiculous. And, they clearly were well reared on the stuff that was blasting out of Austin and Phoenix and the tri-state area and the Pacific Northwest back there at the turn of the 21st century. And they celebrate their beloved blasted out pop of Yearning and Confusions on their, again, really surprisingly great debut album, Little Green House, which was released on one of the best labels releasing their type of music right now, Run for Cover. Now, a common thread through the life of this podcast, we haven't exactly put this as an edict, but it comes up a lot, is that there's a fine line between being reverent and being derivative. Like I said, being reverent versus being derivative. So fine, let's get this out of the way. These young members of Anxious are obviously fond of Fountains of Wayne, and Texas Is the Reason, and Jimmy Eat World,
and early Weezer.
Yeah, early Weezer, and early Death Cab for Cutie, and Not a Surf, and even some of the screamier bands of their era, like Hum and You Will Know Us by the Trail of Dead. This is a hyper melodic, and just plain hyper 32-minute set of 10 tunes. But here's the thing. Now, we know Loud will never go out of style while the earth continues to fill with rebellious, sensitive adherents of electric guitars. But Loud, accompanied by really strong and at times excellent songwriting, performance, and recording, is becoming rarer as TikTok and SoundCloud and other social media platforms inspire the quick fix, literally, to glory. So now we need to celebrate Anxious. Band leaders Dante Malucci and Grady Allen really are talented kids. And I do mean kids because Dante Malucci is 19 years old. But they sure as hell don't sound like kids, though, like really like that kind of kiddish. These songs are pretty damn thoughtful and well structured and well played, and they're also extremely well produced. I mean, this is some a few of these songs are really radio ready and radio friendly, which you wouldn't expect from this kind of, one of these bands that are, they have like friends and other like emo bands you've never heard of and, tour in vans and probably make like $20 a show. But so it's not the kind of thing you would expect from a band of this, of this stature, at least at this point. I mean, look, the two-part harmony on the chorus to this intense yet lovely song called In April is a bona fide two-part harmony. Now, Grady Allen, he's also a guitarist for a more well-known sister band called One Step Closer. They're also on Run for Cover. He's more naturally screamy, but that's countered by Malucci's prettier accompaniment. It could be that they're also listening to the Beach Boys and the Everlys and Fleetwood Mac and bands like that too, neato. What I like about this record, though, is that not just that it rocks in the way that I like my rock to, rock. It also takes a few chances, veering into some acoustic tenderness on the earnest ballad Wayne, and ending the record on an oddly compelling adult contemporary note with the song You When You're Gone. on which Malucci proves to be a lyricist and songwriter of unusual depth. I mean, when I was 19, I was singing Neil Young songs whilst drunk without a clue of what, those lyrics or what he was really saying. But I have a feeling that Malucci has a clue and then some. It may not be the coincidence that the album ends with You When You're Gone. It's a sharp turn from the rest of the record. It's more spare, it's more professionally clean, and more tenderly rendered, but just as tight. And yeah, there's also the guest female vocals on there too. Now, ironically, it's this song that most evokes the radio stylings of 15 or 20 years ago. And hey, it's actually better than anything really ever licensed its way onto Grey's Anatomy back in the day. I mean, that's not really damning with faint praise, but it's the kind of thing that maybe you would have expected to show up on TV back then, back when like people still gave a shit about rock bands. Now that tells me that Anxious can be more than just a genre band, which even positive reviews I've seen of this record, like in places like Pitchfork and Stereo Gun, they seem to peg them as one of these emo power pop bands. Essentially they are. But they seem to have that potential for growth. So, really, I am excited to hear what comes next. Maybe it'll take a happy TikTok accident to break them big, which sucks because there really is a lot of talent, ambition, and professionalism here. One of the better records I've heard all year. You've heard me say, Art, on this cast that this has been the year of the pretty good. Well, this is one of the few albums that's actually better than pretty good. Great, not quite. Like great, not quite, but really, really, really good. I'm wondering if you may not agree with that.
Absolutely generic, cliche, emo bullshit. This album sucks my fucking balls. I hate this record. As soon as I heard it, I was skipping tracks and skipping tracks and skipping tracks. It's like, I mean, and I'm going to call them kids. Do these kids know it's the year 2022 and not 2000?
Yeah, but that's the reason I like this band.
Yeah, I know, but I think it's rubbish, absolute horrid. I've never liked emo in general. There are very few exceptions for me. Connor Oberst's side project, Desaparecidos. After Drive-In, there's not much emo that I've ever liked. This is fucking horrible. This is really bad.
Well, I mean, mentioning at the Drive-In, I mean, that's just an insult. They were never an emo band. They were just basically a metal band. But
well, no, at the Drive-In were pretty emo. They definitely were, especially with the vocals, especially with the kind of guitar playing they had. Emo is post-hardcore, really.
Yeah, I guess you can say that. Now, I mean, look, the closest compared to in my mind to this band is Jimmy Eat World. And, I mean, I've always liked Jimmy Eat World more than you have, and they were a pretty good band. But like I said, I think that this stuff is pretty varied, and I'm actually really impressed with the professionalism and the talent of it. And I do think that, yes, you're right, that it took me a few listens. This was a grower, and it's been growing on me for the course of like 6 weeks, 2 months now. To the point where it actually elevated to the status of, deserving a shout out on this podcast. Just surprisingly good stuff for a bunch of 19 and 20-year-old kids. Hey folks, it's Chris. One of the things we've learned over the life of the Curmudgeon Rock Report is that if you want to build a better podcast, it's a really good idea to listen to other podcasts. It not only keeps us on our toes, but hey, there's a lot of fascinating information out there in podcast land, presented by lots of fascinating people. Here's one podcast that I've been vibing on lately. Cocaine and Rhinestones, The History of Country Music. Host Tyler Mahan Coe, the son of rebel songwriter David Allan Coe, spins really good yarns about the fables, legends, and characters that have dotted the country landscape since its very beginnings. This includes a few tales that are just so insane, yet you have to know that they're true. The main reason to listen to Cocaine and Rhinestones, however, is an intermittent series of episodes of the saga of George Jones and Tammy Wynette. Co has a straightforward, deadpan narrative style that helps you appreciate just how wild these two country icons were. The more you listen, the more your jaw will drop over just how addiction overtook the mind of George Jones. So right after you're done listening to us, check out Cocaine and Rhinestones. It's available at all the places where you find all of the other podcasts. So, Art, as part of this, one of the excitements for me is I got to sort of dig in some of my old books by the author Peter Guralnick, who's probably the greatest chronicler of this sort of early rock/roots music.
He wrote the definitive 2-part biography of Elvis Presley. Awesome books.
Yep, and the definitive biography of Sam Cooke, and he did a whole bunch of other writings on early country western and blues songs, all that. But here's a great book, a great quote from his book Lost Highway that pretty much says it all about the origins and sort of the evolution of rock and roll, or the early evolution. He says, quote, "The music that was recorded, black and white, represented a rural lifestyle gone to the city."
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfect way of putting it.
I will definitely touch on that very soon.
Sure. And then from there, the only other comment I'll make, and then I'll turn it over to you. The common thread in most of this, the electric guitar.
Oh, yeah.
Take any one of those parochials I talked about before, plug in an amp, and it becomes rock and roll.
Yeah. All right. So how did this whole fucking thing start?
Well, that's a fair question.
So this is how, let's go way, way back. In the first half of the 1940s, the post-Great Depression socioeconomic climate of the United States saw a mass migration of people, both white and black, generally move up north from the southern region of the country to large cities in the Midwest, upper Midwest, and the Northeast. What drove these large swaths of people? What drove them up north? Manufacturing and factory jobs, and lots of them. Tons and tons of manual labor work. What was going on that spurred on all this manufacturing? A little old thing called World War II. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in 1941 dragged America into the war, belatedly, if you ask some British people and Europeans, patriotism in the form of war fever gripped the country. With that came a military demand, a demand that eventually became beneficial for the national economy, but a demand, nevertheless, for planes, tanks, jeeps, boats, guns, and all kinds of machinery and every kind of mechanical and metallic component that went with them. War was indeed big business at this time, even a justifiable war. I mentioned earlier the migration of manual laborers from the South. These people tended to be of all types and ethnicities, but during this time, whites and blacks were the most predominant. So for the sake of explaining rock and roll history, let's for now focus on the African Americans of this period. I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of these labor workers were, on the socioeconomic scale, solidly working class or lower. For Black people of this time, musical preferences tended to reflect where they came from regionally and were nominally gospel and any kind of related religious music, jazz, blues, and folk. The latter two being inextricably tied and often overlapping with each other. It's the blues, however, that we need to focus on. That, along with folk, was the easiest style of music to play. All you needed was an acoustic guitar, your own voice, a tale of woe and or heartbreak, and voila, you've got the blues. It's impossible to quantify exactly how many or even how much of a percentage of these migrating Black laborers were amateur blues musicians. But considering the plethora of artists whose records were released by various record labels from the late 1940s to the mid 1950s, it's safe to say a shitload. Blues was and is even to this day a kind of music that was played in clubs and bars and in the South. And in the South, you had all these small clubs and juke joints where blues were played, right? However, the clubs and bars in the large Midwestern and Northeastern cities tended to be, well, really large and attracted
Mm.
large amounts of people. It was hard for blues singers to have their voices, no matter how powerful they were, and their intricate guitar picking, have that all being heard over the din of drunken voices and overall nightlife. Enter amplification. Acoustic guitars were switched to electric guitars, stand up basses were employed, and for maximum effect, drum kits. At the time, normally reserved for jazz bands, drum kits were now utilized to not only give the blues more volume, but to make it more rhythmic, for lots of people in big clubs to dance to. So primal, persistent, sweaty, groovy, and raw R&B in its original form, meaning rhythm and blues, was born. And an exciting new form of music started to take Black America by storm. Starting in the middle of the 1940s, several notable artists in different parts of the country started to get noticed by small record labels, several of whom had major label distribution. And they were signed, and these artists would eventually release records, mainly in the form of singles, that would become seminal and historically important in the development of blues and rhythm and blues. Most notable was Muddy Waters, recording for Chicago's Chess Records. Yes, Waters became known as one of the greatest blues artists of all time, but it's important to note that in his time, he was known as rhythm and blues, as a rhythm and blues artist, for sheer virtue of his playing electric guitar and having a full band, bassist and drummer, behind him. Chess also released music by the legendary and influential singer Howlin' Wolf and whoever he happened to
Mm.
cobble together as his backing band. He had millions of bands. Other notable blues artists who crossed over to the R&B side of things were Detroit's John Lee Hooker over at Los Angeles's Modern Records, Jimmy Reed at Chicago's VJ Records, and Elmore James, who didn't even make it to the North or to the Midwest, but was so inspired by the new electric blues sound that he became an R&B star on Jackson, Mississippi's Trumpet Records. Elmore James, by the way, if you don't know, the one of the greatest, if not the greatest, slide guitar players ever. If you like
Yeah.
the Allman Brothers and Dwayne Allman, go check out Elmore James. That's where
Yeah.
Dwayne Allman got his shit from.
That's
Chris,
pretty. Yeah.
any other greats from this period of the real R&B, quote unquote, that you like?
Yeah. I mean, there's Willie Dixon,
Sure.
and then you got to remember. I mean, a lot of this to kind of add to what you're saying. That there's the blues and there's rhythm and blues, but
Right.
there's a commonality to all of this, and it seeps into a lot of different forms. But it all comes from a style of music that was predominant in the South.
Yeah.
It was a black, all the way back to the 1880s, called boogie woogie.
Right.
And this is a really common thing. I mean, it seeped over into big band music. And we'll talk about that later, but like big band had a big influence on some of these folks they're really like the seminal acts and like the big time acts. And so I think a lot of it sort of comes out of that. I mean, you basically named the folks that sort of came out of that. I mean, I think that another name worth mentioning here, because I think that she was part of this. She's more gospel-y, but Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Yeah.
And who embraced electric guitar and embraced jump blues.
Yeah.
To basically, to be a holy roller. She was going into like the devil's nightclubs to sing about Jesus. Like I said, a strange history. And you hit the nail on the head. It's that migration, and all points along it, basically Mississippi up to Chicago.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, New Orleans never really left New Orleans.
Yeah.
But from there, like everything else is an offshoot of the Mississippi River. I mean, it kind of starts in Mississippi, and Boogie Woogie actually kind of developed really Marshall, Texas, actually, was up there in the northeast corner of Texas. So like that in Texarkana and Arkansas, and we'll talk about it later, St. Louis, and
Yeah.
just sort of all these, Kansas City, all these points along the Mississippi became hugely important. So
Yeah.
yeah, and if it wasn't for Chicago, you probably don't get the amps.
Right.
Like you
Right.
said, it's these back porch bluesmen that actually needed now to be heard. So
Right.
good
All right.
point.
So how did this rhythm and blues become rock and roll? Okay.
Good question.
Now, it's impossible to talk about the roots of rock and roll without talking about race, racial issues, and even racial segregation. In the first half of the 20th century, any music that came from African American culture, mainly jazz and blues, was deemed as quote unquote race music.
Yep.
By the end of the 1940s, once rhythm and blues became a legitimately popular genre that sold a bunch of records, the record industry decided to track the sales of best-selling artists and singles by creating the national R&B chart. Unfortunately, this did little to dissuade the white mainstream of society to call any music by black people race music. This would take another decade and a half to end. So, why do I bring up race in regard to the music? Well, here's where the story gets juicy.
Ooh.
Not every black factory worker with a musical soul who initially migrated from the South became successful in the rhythm and blues game. Once the war ended, quite a few of these aspiring blues and R&B folks went back to the South. They went back home, and they brought this new sound with them, a new electrified, danceable version of the blues, if you will, which is what rhythm and blues is. This coincided with, actually, maybe produced the growth spurt and proliferation throughout all the southern states of clubs, bars, and juke joints that entertain people, mostly black, with the charging sounds of hot and sweaty R&B music. Herein lies the birth of what became known as the Chitlin Circuit, of bars and clubs where countless blues, R&B, and eventually rock and roll artists cut their teeth and honed their chops, many of whom before they went on to greater fame. Why was it called the Chitlin Circuit? Well, chitlins are in the South, a southern region of the United States, it's a very popular dish. For those of you who don't know, chitlins means pig intestines. Like I said, popular in the American South, as well as here in South Korea, where we call it sundae. In any
Yep.
case, the bars, clubs, and juke joints that made up the Chitlin Circuit in the immediate post-war South proved to be an experimental petri dish for enterprising and ambitious R&B musicians and artists. Now, if blues and R&B were the predominant musical genre for Black Americans in the South, what was it for white Americans in the South? Country music. Now, for
Yep.
those of you who are only familiar with the overly commercialized, overly homogenized, soulless vapidity of modern country music that comes out of the Nashville establishment, old school country music has a lilting swing to it. And the best of it has some beautiful narrative storytelling. It's those two key elements of country music that started to get injected into R&B by various artists and musicians throughout the South, seemingly at the same time. In chemistry, two seemingly harmless compounds can be mixed together to create an explosive combination. Well, add the sashaying swing and acute lyricism of country music to the primal, raw, sexual energy of R&B, and you get this explosive concoction called rock and roll. It's impossible to pin down the so-called creation of rock and roll to one person. It was a regional phenomenon that developed and sprouted in different parts of the South through a slew of like-minded musicians and artists, many of whom ran into each other, knew each other, and borrowed from each other quite liberally.
Yes, very much borrowed from each other.
Yeah. What we can generally identify, however, is the time period when rock and roll started to be recorded and played on local/regional R&B radio stations throughout the country that cater to Black audiences. That would be the early 1950s. Not that it was called rock and roll back then, mind you. It was just considered a different kind of R&B. If rhythm and blues is a different kind of blues, this was a different kind of rhythm and blues. As for the phrase rock and roll itself, that's more of a complicated story. If you want to get real literal, way back in 1934, white vocal jazz trio, the Boswell Sisters, sang a song called Rock and Roll in the film Transatlantic Merry-Go-Round. Frankly, I find it doubtful that a lot of black people on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder in the South watched or were familiar with that film. A more likely source can be found in both the blues and gospel music. The notion of rocking, quote unquote, was normally associated with dancing or losing oneself to the music, and there are several examples of that word being used in both old blues and old gospel songs. Back in 1942, well-known music journalist Maury Orodenker, writing in Billboard magazine, described the great gospel singer, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the person you mentioned earlier, Chris. Her song, Rock Me, he described it as, quote, rock and roll spiritual singing. Yet, possibility that a white Jewish critic may have coined the phrase rock and roll. How about that?
Go figure.
Yet, dig deeper, and you'll find the expression rock and roll really was a Southern black colloquial term for sex. Yes, rockin' and rollin' meant fucking.
Yep.
You can find that term in the song 60 Minute Man. Gee, I wonder what he's doing for 60 minutes. A major 1951 R&B hit by the Dominoes, where the singer salaciously sings, I rock 'em and I roll 'em all night. Hint, he ain't talking about rocking and rolling dice.
Nope. No, there's no dice in the making of this here rockin' and rollin'.
Yeah. We'll talk more in length about the legendary Cleveland radio DJ Alan Freed and his contribution to the popularizing of rock and roll in the next episode. But for now, let's just say he was a true fan of black music who, via the music, was very much in tune not only with trends, but with the colloquial vernacular used by the many black musicians coming mostly out of the South during this time. It was in 1951 when he started playing this new mutant strain of swinging R&B on his radio shows, and he referred to it as rock and roll. It spread like wildfire from there. Chris, I've spoken a lot about how the infusion of country swing into rhythm and blues resulted in rock and roll, but there are other more subtle elements that went into this concoction. Tell us.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I mean, I think you hit like the main notes with the sort of the country and blues influences. Kind of like I said, it was like they had the mutant child. But I think there's a few things that we need to bring up, and it really goes back earlier. I mean, you got to go back to the 20s for some of this. There's a forerunner to the country western of like, Hank Williams and some of those folks. And that was Western swing and I guess what was known as hillbilly. That's right. What they called it, hillbilly music.
It was called, in Chuck Berry's time, he called it hillbilly music.
Yeah. And even before that, I mean, you're talking like Jimmy Rogers and Ernest Tubb, who was the Texas troubadour.
Yodel, all that yodeling shit.
Yes. Yeah. He was the blue yodel guy. There's Bob Wills. Who's he's a fiddler. And so you get a lot of that. And a lot of that stuff is very waltzy, but also just kind of has this whooping spirit and has a lot of that sort of, it's not just sex, but love.
Yeah.
And then it got a little theatrical because from the Western swing is where you get the movie era singing cowboys. The most famous one of these is Gene Autry. And he comes up a little bit later in this episode. One of the great happy accidents in the history of rock and roll involved a Gene Autry song. And so we'll get to that. So there's that. And then you have gospel, not just the Rosetta Tharpe sort of sped up version of it. But I guess in some ways you can call rock and roll anti-gospel because a lot of these folks were reared in the church. Yeah. And I think the appeal of, rocking and rolling, otherwise known as fucking.
Yeah.
And some of this stuff, it was like an anti-gospel in the sense of it was a rebellion based on what you knew.
Yeah.
But the singing styles, I mean, even Elvis, I mean, there's a quote that says, his singing style is a combination of rhythm and blues and country and western, but really gospel.
Yeah.
And he attributes to that. And I got to thinking, the old song "Blue Moon of Kentucky," the old bluegrass song by Bill Monroe.
Yeah.
It's a bluegrass song, but the melody, that's a gospel song.
Yeah.
And so that really kind of gets into that, and even like the Mahalia Jacksons of the world. I mean, they had a huge influence. Like Mahalia Jackson was a big influence on Rosetta Tharpe, and actually it was a big influence on Elvis. Doo-wop. We have to talk about doo-wop. Doo-wop was essentially, it's an urban creation that was inspired by some of the early rhythm and blues that was happening in the 40s. But what this was, doo-wop, it's not necessarily a cappella, but it's these 4 and 5 part harmonies made by relatively poor, mostly black men from cities like Baltimore was a big hub for doo-wop.
New York.
Yeah, New York, obviously, and then a couple of other Midwestern towns, but like basically Baltimore, D.C., Harvey and the Moonglows, which is a latter day doo-wop, later on, but they were D.C. So D.C., Baltimore was like the Ravens, if it was a bird, the Orioles, the Ravens, they all came from Baltimore. But it's a curious mix because what they were doing was they were taking the dramatics and dynamics of Tin Pan Alley and barbershop quartet stuff, like basically the most corny theatrical white music, and they tweaked that and stylized it for city black folk,
and gave it some soul.
Yes, and gave it some soul. And then there was a lot of onomatopoeia that went on, onomatopoeia, not pita, that went on here too, because they didn't have instruments, and so you always had the guy do 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 do, and that actually, and obviously that had a big influence later on with like, the surf bands, the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean and all of that. And so in terms of the vocal stylings of that, in terms of the sort of the aesthetics of that, and basically what a lot of rock and roll did was it took a lot of that kind of dramatics of doo-wop and sped it up a little bit. And you get a lot of that sort of early pop there. I mentioned Boogie Woogie. Definitely have to mention that. I also think that skiffle is worth mentioning. Now, skiffle, we talked about this a little bit in our Grateful Dead episode. Skiffle is actually, it's defined by... It was basically like the earliest form of jam band music, but it was played on all these homemade instruments.
Right. Basically, it's a variation of jazz. It came out of New Orleans, actually.
Yeah, but it was like washboards and jug bands. Or it was like, like jugs and washboards and like basin tubs, and you're taking that kind of stuff and getting instrumentation out of that. And so it's basically like a representation of New Orleans jazz, but done on all this homemade stuff. And obviously, a lot of the British bands, skiffle became a big thing in Britain, and that eventually leads to, no joke, Jimmy Page was started off in skiffle band.
Yeah.
The Beatles started off as the Quarrymen. And so you have to mention that. And then last but not least, and this is a big deal, big band. And, like Duke Ellington, but also like Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller and some of these folks.
I would say Count Basie more than some of those.
Yeah.
Because Count Basie's swing music, his swing jazz music, was very, very bluesy. Listen to Count Basie. He was the most blues based out of all those jazz guys.
Oh yeah, but he was a total adherent of Boogie Woogie. I mean, of all those guys, he was the most Boogie Woogiest. I'm just making a point that it also it crept over into the white big bands as well.
Right.
And I've to give you a preview, Chuck Berry basically said that he was doing big band music cranked up with electric guitar.
Yeah.
And so he kind of So that's an obvious influence there as well. So there's lots of that. And then one final comment in terms of the rhythms of rock and roll and country music, and the stuff that came out of like Memphis or anything like that. We have to say that one of the legacies of the locomotive in America are the rhythms and beats of rock and roll. Think about it. Chug, chug, a chug, chug, a chug, chug, a chug, chug, a chug, 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 a chug, and then boogie woogie is chug, 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 all of that kind of stuff. And so yeah, a lot of disparate, influences.
On this episode, Chris and I brought you part 1 of the first golden age of rock, where we discussed the origins of the genre in the American South and how it grew and was nurtured by African American culture. For the next and final installment, part 2, we will delve into how rock and roll crossed over to the mainstream of American popular culture. What started as a grassroots movement in the South was soon co-opted by corporate America, and black music was given a white face and sold to white teenagers. But hey, some of this music was really freaking good. The importance of Sun Records and early Elvis Presley is discussed, as well as Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, the Everly Brothers, and a whole bunch of underappreciated rock and roll greats from this era, both white and black. Join us next time as we conclude the first golden age of rock. All right. Chris and I, for all you listeners, in this episode of this part 1 of the first golden age of rock, we have identified who we believe are the main 4 early black pioneers of rock and roll. But before we go into those people, these 4 guys who we consider to be the 4 pivotal African-American artists who not only pioneered early rock and roll on the radio, but popularized it on a grassroots level before a certain white guy from Memphis, Tennessee would make it explode into a pop cultural phenomenon.
Pretty much.
That's next episode. Let's give some shout outs to some individuals and groups who deserve some recognition as well for helping pioneer rock and roll. Chris, Big Joe Turner.
Yep, Big Joe Turner was so good. He never really changed up his style, but you could fit him into any genre you wanted to over this course of like 30 years. Basically started out doing like boogie woogie, and then he became rhythm and blues. Then he became blues. Then he became rock and roll. Just a really talented vocalist and songwriter, and charismatic performer. He started off as Big Joe Turner. By the 70s, he was Huge Joe Turner. He had gotten quite obese, but like I said, great showman. Had some early songs. I mentioned one of them earlier. I believe I did. Rollin' Pete. Rollin' Pete was the song that he did with another one of these early boogie woogie guys named Pete Johnson. If you listen to it, I think Chuck Berry had an influence on that. It had that same kind of, think about some of the rhythms of some of the earlier Chuck Berry songs. You can find it in the work of Joe Turner.
That's all right, Mama. That's all right with you. Elvis's first big hit. That's a Big Joe Turner song.
Yes, it is.
You wrote that.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And it has that kind of flavor and that kind of sexuality to it. Yeah. So really good stuff.
Another one deserves a shout out. Ike Turner. Yes, that Ike Turner.
Yes, well before he was beating the crap out of Tina Turner. Wait a second. Allegedly. Although I think he's said it. Yeah. He was kind of a big, in a way, it was kind of like a rockin' big band. Yeah. A lot of times folks credit a song that he released called Rocket 88 as the earliest rock song. And again, Ike was a talented guy, but in a lot of ways, he was a band leader, and he was a combination blues guy and just basically classic rhythm and blues. And so he just sort of, he was about 51, 52 was when he was active. Now, I disagree that could count as the first rock song. I think we're going to cover that in a little bit with one of our four artists. But yeah, I definitely had an influence on the formation of how how rock and roll was arranged, and the tempos, and he was kind of in that cross section of, it wasn't quite rock and roll at that point,
right?
But it was really close.
Yeah, definitely. Another one. They're a group, the Orioles, and not the baseball team from Baltimore.
Nope, not the baseball team. The Orioles. This was one of the great, I think the greatest doo-wop group of all time. Probably the most influential one. They go back all the way to 1947. They have a wonderful song called "It's Too Soon to Know," which pretty much influenced all of the doo-wop that came after it. Like I said, just a very dramatic sense of how to perform that with these wonderful vocal arrangements and a little bit of jazz guitar accompaniment to it. And so it's basically, like we said, it's rural rhythm and blues as rendered by black men from the city too broke to afford their own instruments. And so just really ingenious stuff. And so, from the Orioles, you get the Penguins, and then, eventually you get fucking like Neil Sedaka and the Beach Boys, and you get some of those, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. It kind of leads itself. And so there's a string of rock and roll that starts from the Orioles that, actually, if you think about it, it's kind of like the Chuck Berry stuff slowed way, way down, and done much cheesier. Yeah.
And the last group I'll mention before we go on to the early Black pioneers, I already mentioned them earlier, the Dominoes, and they had that big hit, 60 Minute Man, where it's an R&B song, but the lyrical preoccupation of rock and roll is already laid down by those guys. This is basically singing about sex.
Yeah, and it's actually, in movie lore, it's really famous. There's a famous sex scene in the movie Bull Durham.
Yeah,
that is set to 60 Minute Man as well. So go check out that movie, and it's there. But yeah, great song. It basically that's somewhere between Boogie Woogie and like Chuck Berry.
Right. Well, now let us go into the four artists we are going to profile as being the real, the badass early African-American pioneers of rock and roll. And the first person we'll talk about is Fats Domino.
Oh, yeah.
We've established how this beast called rock and roll came from the American South as an intense rocking variation of rhythm and blues. It's only fitting that New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz, would produce its own unique flavor of rhythm and blues. The rolling off-kilter grooves of the boogie-woogie piano maestro, Professor Longhair, helped define this thick, swampy, down in the bayou sound of, New Orleans rhythm and blues. But it was Fats Domino who gave a robust, muscular form to this thick, swampy sound, and was arguably the first commercially successful, definitively R&B artist who crossed over to rock and roll and thus the pop charts. Don't believe that? Here's Elvis Presley himself. Quote, "He was a real influence on me when I started out. He's the real king of rock and roll." Well, when the king of rock and roll calls this guy the real king of rock and roll, guess what? We're starting with this guy. Born Antoine Dominique Domino in New Orleans in 1928, he learned the piano at age 10, and by age 14, he was already performing in New Orleans bars. He got his first big break when at 19, he joined local great Billy Diamond's band. I don't know who Billy Diamond is, but he's really big in New Orleans. And he got tagged with the nickname Fats because Domino reminded Diamond of the legendary jazz pianist Fats Waller. And the other reason was, well, young Antoine liked to eat.
Mm-hmm.
The second and even bigger break was when he was signed as a solo artist in 1949 to Imperial Records, an indie label with major label distribution through Capitol, and quickly put out his first single, The Fat Man, a much lyrically cleaner adaptation of Jack Dupree's 1940 tale of a drug addiction called Junker Blues. The song was a monster hit, peaking at number 2 on the R&B chart and selling 1 million copies within 2 years. Chris, you mentioned some of the songs that you mentioned as the earliest rock and roll singles. To this day, there are quite a few who debate that this is the first rock and roll single slash song.
Yeah.
If so, it's also the first rock and roll single to go platinum.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, for 1949, I mean, it's extraordinary because it has that bottom end. It's
Right.
kind of like it's like the slowest form of boogie woogie, but it has this bottom end and it has this soul,
Right.
and it really does just kind of rock, and it has that kind of with Domino was just a genius. He wasn't the showiest piano player. It wasn't like Jerry Lee Lewis,
Right.
but he
Yeah.
just he got a sound and a resonance from it. And between that and his voice, I mean, pretty much everything Fats Domino was on like the low end of the register.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was like low on top of low on top of low on top of low, and it was just awesome.
Right.
And
Right.
so, yeah, for that to be him to be doing that in 1949, and in my mind, is extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, I guess things went in threes for Fats Domino because 3 years
Sure.
later, in 1952, he had his first R&B number 1 single with "Going Home." 3 years later, in 1955, he had the biggest break of his career when the gorgeous R&B masterpiece "Ain't That a Shame" not only hit number 1 on the R&B chart, but climbed as high as number 10 on the pop singles chart. Domino was now a superstar, was being called a rock and roll singer, and was touring on package tours with other R&B rock and roll artists and playing to mixed race audiences. For those of you out there who need no more than 5 Fats Domino songs for your Spotify or Apple Music or YouTube Plus playlists, here are 2 more to complete your set. The lovely loping Blueberry Hill, which hit number 2 on the Billboard pop chart in 1956, and the rockin' stomper I'm Walkin', which hit number 4 on the Billboard pop chart in 1957. The man is an absolute legend, and he should be remembered more. The next seminal person we have to talk about, Bo Diddley. Now,
Oh yeah.
while Bo Diddley didn't have like the pop chart success of the other 3 artists that we're highlighting in this episode, he was every bit as important as them, and arguably maybe even a little more important in regard to the transitioning of R&B into rock and roll. Diddley's importance wasn't in his pop chart success nor in his songwriting skills, but more than anything else, it was his sound.
Oh yeah.
Diddley created a new, never before heard soundscape for R&B by incorporating African rhythms and a 5-accent clave beat. You all know it. Chink, 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 chink. That clave beat is common in all Afro-Cuban and Cuban-derived Latin music. The result, mambo, salsa, you name it, they all have that beat. And the result was a loud, primal, primitive, overwhelmingly sexually charged, swinging, eminently danceable form of rhythm and blues that was so powerful in its scope that if it isn't pure rock and roll in its essence, then I really don't know what else is. In the short term, his influence stretched to Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. In the middle term, it stretched out to the Beatles and more prominently to the Rolling Stones. In the long term, you could hear the impact of Bo Diddley on Led Zeppelin and even The Clash. Born Ellis Bates in Macomb, Mississippi in 1928. That's Bo Diddley's real name. Unable to support a family, his mother gave young Ellis up to her cousin, and eventually he was adopted by his mom's cousin's family, and he adopted the name McDaniel. So he became young Ellis McDaniel, and his family, they moved to Chicago when he was 5 years old. Until his mid-teenage years, he played violin as part of his church congregation until the pulsating rhythms of rhythm and blues and R&B intoxicated and led him to switch to guitar. In later years, Diddley attributed the trance-like rhythms in his music to the highly musical church gatherings of his youth in Chicago. When Diddley would go on to claim John Lee Hooker as a chief influence, it's no surprise. Hooker's brand of blues was incessantly rhythmic and had hints of incantation, harkening back to old black spiritual music, which itself harkened back to traditional African rhythms. It was with a repertoire of Hooker and Muddy Waters songs that Diddley graduated from playing street corners and markets as a teenager with a pickup band to playing clubs in his early 20s in Chicago's South Side with his nascent band, to being discovered by Chess Records in said clubs and being signed to a record deal. Yes, the same Chess Records that at the time had Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Chuck Berry, and Etta James on its roster now had
Yeah.
Bo Diddley. Wow.
Not bad. Not bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, how the hell did Ellis McDaniel get the name Bo Diddley? There are conflicting stories. Diddley himself added to that conflict, saying his R&B peers gave that name to him as a rib, with a Diddley being a truncation of diddly squat, meaning nothing. You ain't diddly squat. He also said that the name belonged to a singer whom his adoptive mother knew. He also said that he got that name from his high school classmates when he was part of a local community boxing club. A more tantalizing possibility implies that young Mr. Diddley was a well-read chap, for there is a short story called Black Death, written by the great Harlem Renaissance author Zora Neale Hurston in 1921, which depicts a womanizer called Beau, B-E-A-U, Diddley, who impregnates a woman, refuses responsibility for the child, and meets his punishment and fate at the hands of a voodoo witch doctor.
Yeah,
Whatever it is.
that pretty much sounds like every Bo Diddley song from the late 50s, doesn't it?
It does. Whatever the origin, the name Bo Diddley stuck, and it was also the title of his first single. Yes, he named his first song after himself, which was released in 1955 and skyrocketed to #1 on the R&B chart. His intense, primal signature sound already intact, Diddley would go on to have a consistent 50-year career before he died in 2008, but it's his singles in the 1950s that are the greatest distillation of his greatness and influences. For your streaming playlists out there, folks, in addition to the song Bo Diddley, also check out Pretty Thing from 1955, #1 and #4 in the R&B chart. His most popular song, Who Do You Love, from 1956, made famous by George Thorogood in 1978, and Mona, I Need You Baby from 1957, popularized by the Rolling Stones on their 1965 album, The Rolling Stones Now. Chris?
Yeah, and you also have to remember, like, Diddley doesn't get credit. He was a hell of a blues man, too. And
Yeah.
I think his other most famous song besides Who Do You Love is I'm a Man.
Yeah.
Which, will be licensed from now until the end of time. And actually is covered by, of all people, Muddy Waters in the band's The Last Waltz. So he could play it straight, but it really is kind of funny. And like you said, a lot of Diddley, like when he did his interviews, very charismatic, but it was hard to tell when he was playing it straight and when he was pulling your leg.
Yeah.
I think he had this kind of jovial, kind of kidding sense of humor. Very, very smart guy. Like one of the greatest interview. He was just a tremendous interview. Speaking of which, if you go on YouTube, there was an old show maybe like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, called Speaking Freely. It was about First Amendment issues, but Diddley went on there, and the host asks him, where's the Bo Diddley beat come from? And well, first thing he says is a lot of people think it's just a play on Hambone. And it's like, no, and then he kind of jokes around. Hambone goes like this, dun, 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 and where his mind is, dun, 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 dun. And he does mention the African religious chant, but he also tells a story, which is hilarious, that he says that he's just messing around in a rehearsal one day, and he was big into country music at the time, and he's just messing around. He's trying to play "Jingle Jangle Jingle" by Gene Autry. I have spurs that jingle, jangle, jingle. And it went spectacularly wrong, and it became this sort of that skittering, like you said, that 5-note kind of dun 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 dun. And it became that, and he said, well, guys, we should work with this. Now that might be bullshit, but that's pretty funny that Gene Autry might have been the forerunner to the Bo Diddley beat. When you think about it, but to me, Diddley, when I was thinking about this episode, what James Brown is to the 1, Bo Diddley is to the 4.
Yeah.
Because, that's really kind of the cadence of it. It's like it ascends on 1, 2, 3, and then dips suddenly on 4.
You're right.
And it has this kind of like, it's almost hypnotic in the way that he does that. And like you said, throughout history, and we don't have time, but I'll give you one example. The Bo Diddley beat shows up in all kinds of songs, in all kinds of genres, all throughout rock and roll history.
Sure.
A good example of it is "She's the One" by Springsteen.
Yeah.
And he even acknowledges that's a Bo Diddley beat. So, and even the Beach Boys employed a Bo Diddley beat a time or two. But like I said, engaging guy. Had the coolest looking guitar ever. That rectangle thing.
Yeah.
It's like this long neck with a rectangle body. It had this like awesome sound, and he was one of these guys, like a self-taught engineer, and he tells a story on that same interview with Speaking Freely that he had this chance to cut a record for his label there, like submit this. But all he had was an old like 78 vinyl, and he experimented with it, and he found some lacquer, and he lacquered both sides of this existing vinyl, and he figured out that he could cut new grooves into the vinyl. And so he recorded Bo Diddley and "I'm a Man" as a demo for his label. Basically by lacquering somebody else's record.
Wow.
And recording on and putting it on top of that, which is kind of an amazing story. So amazing guy. You're right. Didn't have as much commercial success as he deserved. He's probably made more money dead than he ever made alive because of licensing.
Yeah,
which is too bad.
It's a lot of people. Speaking of someone who did make a lot of money in his time, we move on to Little Richard. Woo! Where do we start with him?
Wop baba loo bop or wop bam boom.
His personal life alone has such an epic scope that it could take up an entire episode. You have this very effeminate gay black man who grew up in the segregated South in the 1940s and spent most of his life toggling between indulging his sexuality in the kinkiest fashions, sex orgies, spying on guys in bathrooms, yada, yada. Between that and finding Jesus and being a minister, and spending most of the 1970s absolutely ripped on cocaine and PCP. But
and heroin.
But let's focus on the music, shall we? While Little Richard made an impact on the national consciousness at around the same time as Elvis Presley, he had been kicking around in the music scene for years before Elvis and was putting out records as early as 1951. It was around this time that he not only made a name for himself on the Chitlin circuit, but also in underground gay nightclubs throughout the South. Before this, after he left home as a teenager, he was born Richard Wayne Penniman in Macon, Georgia in 1932. He got his start playing minstrel shows, vaudeville-type shows, and tent revivals, all while wearing outlandish costumes and dressed in drag. These years of experience with tough crowds resulted in Richard's brand of R&B, eventually called and referred to as rock and roll, being the most outrageous, flamboyant, decadent, and explosive of any of the genres founding fathers that we've mentioned here. In his peak years, he also employed a rich horn section that was the perfect counterpoint to his wailing vocals. And oh my God, that voice.
Oh, yeah.
He was by far the best singer of this early rock and roll era. And to this day, he's still arguably one of rock's 5 greatest all-time vocalists.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt.
I mean, check just the list of people who just owe their lives to this guy. The Beatles were always extremely open about their love of Little Richard and how he influenced them, especially in the early days. Both James Brown and Otis Redding idolized him. Ike Turner once claimed that Tina Turner's vocal delivery was based on Richard's. In Bob Dylan's senior year school book in 1959, he mentioned that his main ambition was to be the keyboardist in Little Richard's band. Dylan's snarky humor for sure, but he did sincerely admire him. Jimi Hendrix once said, who by the way was part of Little Richard's touring band in the mid 60s, once said that he wanted to do with the guitar what Richard did with his voice. Both Bob Seger and John Fogerty of Creedence Clearwater Revival admitted to being in awe of him growing up. Michael Jackson admitted to Richard being a big influence on him pre-Off the Wall. Prince practically took his early androgynous look and vocal style from Little Richard. Mick Jagger once said Richard was his introduction to R&B music and called him, quote, the originator and my first idol. Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin once said he wasn't interested in music until he heard Little Richard for the first time when he was 13. David Bowie is quoted as saying that when he heard Little Richard for the first time, he thought he heard the voice of God. Elton John has repeatedly said he was inspired to play piano after hearing Little Richard. Lou Reed called Little Richard, quote, his rock and roll hero. The vocals of Ian Gillan from Deep Purple would be unimaginable without the influence of Little Richard. The outrageous flamboyance and vocal histrionics of Queen's Freddie Mercury would be unimaginable without Little Richard's influence. Angus Young of AC/DC once said his signature guitar style was developed by trying to imitate the sound of Richard's voice. That's what Angus Young was trying to do with guitar. Lemmy Kilmister of Motorhead worshipped him. The list goes on and on. For you streamers out there, here are the hits from 1955 to 58. The incredible Tutti Frutti, number 2 on the R&B chart, number 18 in the pop chart. Side note, the opening verses, Tutti Frutti, all Rudy, Tutti Frutti, all Rudy, were, according to Little Richard's drummer at the time, Charles Connor, quote, Tutti Frutti, good booty. If it's right, if it's tight, it's all right. And if it's greasy, it makes it easy. Yes, folks, Tutti Frutti was mid-20th century Southern black slang for anal sex. And he had a huge hit for it. That's rock and roll, baby. Yep. Long Tall Sally, the song that almost every single British rock group in the early 1960s covered, reached number 1 in the R&B chart and number 6 on the pop chart. Rip It Up, number 1 R&B, number 17 pop. Jenny Jenny, number 2 R&B, number 10 pop. Keep It Knockin', number 2 R&B, number 8 pop. And finally, the immortal Good Golly Miss Molly, number 2 R&B, number 8 pop. The man was and still in death is an American treasure. Chris?
Yeah, Good Golly Miss Molly, otherwise known as Traveling Band by CCR, which Little Richard made sure to sue John Fogerty over, for sure. Yeah, Little Richard is extraordinary, just not only even as a musician, but just as a story. You also forgot Lucille.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's his best song.
Yeah.
Lucille is an incredible song. Yeah. But the thing about with Little Richard, it's the flamboyance, it's the showmanship, it's the voice. It's the not electricity as in like plugged in guitars. Just he was an electric performer. The charisma, all of that. Anybody who ever wanted to just kind of primp and preen and be a lead man on a stage owes everything to Little Richard. I mean, Little Richard's the front man of all front men. He kind of invented, or he's the icon of that whole thing. Like I said, incredible singer. There's just, again, a lot of influences there. He's probably the least boogie woogie influenced of these guys. He's more, there's some element of jazz to some of his stuff, and big band, and just, straight rhythm and blues. But like I said, he's an interesting story. Well, first off, by the way, so his band in the mid 60s not only had Hendrix in it, but Billy Preston. And great stories that in researching this episode. So Hendrix, basically the only one in Little Richard's band that was allowed to be flamboyant was Little Richard.
Yeah.
And boy, Little Richard hated Hendrix because Hendrix would like wear those shirts, and like Little Richard would be like, "Fuck that, change your shirt," or the way he'd play guitar. No, you can't smile up here, And so, needless to say, Hendrix wasn't in the band all that long, and and he hated the experience. So, absolutely influential. But he was a gay man who was beaten by his dad and thrown out of his house for not being man enough when he's 13 years old. And so he comes from that abusive background. And yeah, he did have this tension between gospel and anti-gospel. So he gets big in the 50s and obviously gets decadent with the orgies and all of that. And then he decides that, he finds, he said in an interview at that point he was Jewish. Which it's kind of hard to believe. He said that in a BBC interview in 1972, but he was just inspired. So he ended up going to a Bible college somewhere in Alabama and spent a couple years doing that. And then he was doing gospel for a few years, but inevitably found his way back to rock and roll because there was interest in his stuff in Europe. And so he went back to that. And like you said, Art, by the 70s, he had completely just decided to just lose it. And he just became he was on all kinds of drugs. He was doing sexapalooza, drugapalooza, decadent palooza and all of that. But then he had a streak and there's a fascinating interview. If you want to find this, he appeared on Letterman in 82. And this was during one of his cleaned up phases when he was finding and espousing the Lord. But he tells the story in that within a couple year period in the late 70s, he lost 4 people to drugs, including his brother at a party. And his brother OD'd at a party that he was at with him. And so he decided to clean up. And, he goes on Letterman and, he's in a suit and no makeup and, no wig and the afro. And it's Little Richard. I mean, he's talking like Little Richard. He has the same sense of humor, but he even says that he spent most of his life gay, but now he's, found the glory of Christ.
Yeah.
And proceeds to sing One Day at a Time, Sweet Jesus. But yeah, that didn't last. And then I think he spent the rest of his life kind of just confused, where he would go back and forth between his accepting himself. And sometimes I think maybe he still, stayed with the Lord, but would put the makeup on to go make some money.
Right.
And then at the very end of his life, he, because he grew up, the religious tradition he grew up with is Seventh-day Adventist.
Right.
And he kind of went back in that direction in his 80s. And he showed up on Indiana, some sort of televangelism network a couple of times to make appearances talking about how he's come to Jesus and rejected everything that he's done. And, it's like he's proud of his work, but he rejects the kind of stuff that it stood for. But in the meantime, he's wearing purple suits and glittery shoes. So like I said, so you can take the man out of the gay, but you can't take the gay out of the man. And that was kind of the thing. So it's just that tension and back and forth. So fascinating personal story, but just singular talent, who also had a chip on his shoulder. I mean, he spent 60 years telling everybody about how he invented rock and roll and how he got screwed out of money and how he was the real king. And, everybody should bend over and kiss his ass. So amazing character. And without him, our next guy, basically, you could say kind of invented rock and roll as we know it and as it became popularized. But without Little Richard, you don't get rock and roll because of the showmanship and the charisma.
Right. Well, speaking of showmanship and charisma, this next guy, our final guy for this episode, had it in spades. Chuck Berry. Yep. He is perhaps the most unique and maybe the most influential of all these guys, although the ghosts of Little Richard would have something to say about that. Chuck Berry's chief contributions to the development of rock and roll are twofold. First, there are the guitar riffs. More than any of the other early African American pioneers, Berry he sped up R&B guitar riffs, brought them front and center, and practically invented what we now think of when we think of the rock guitar intro riff. Without this, there are no Rolling Stones, no Who, no Led Zeppelin, no nothing.
Right.
Second and most underrated of all is Berry's lyrical storytelling. Here is where Berry showed the influence of country music more than any of the other black pioneers. Berry's songs always told a story, whether they were about young men running away from their current conditions and pursuing a life of music and fun, sometimes with the cops in pursuit, or lusting after underage girls, a recurring theme in some of Berry's lyrics.
Yeah.
Generally, though, Berry wrote specifically about the desires of young people, teen dances, romance, fast cars, high school life, and overall consumer culture. If rock and roll got big when it was promoted to young people, it was Berry who wrote about them, wrote to them, and wrote for them. His influence is immeasurable. This podcast's favorite music critic, Robert Christgau, quote, "He is the greatest of rock and rollers." John Lennon, quote, "If you give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry." Ted Nugent, quote, "If you don't know every Chuck Berry lick, you cannot play rock guitar." Bob Dylan, quote, "He's the Shakespeare of rock and roll." Bruce Springsteen, quote, "Chuck Berry was rock's greatest practitioner, guitarist, and the greatest pure rock and roll writer who ever lived." Leonard Cohen, quote, "All of us are footnotes to the words of Chuck Berry." Listen, man, when Dylan calls you Shakespeare and Springsteen says you're the greatest pure writer, you know you're fucking good.
Yeah.
For all you streamers and playlist lovers out there, here are the hits from 1955 to 58. Same time span as Little Richard, by the way. Maybelline, #1 on the R&B chart, #5 on the pop chart. School Day, Ring Ring Goes the Bell, #1 R&B, #3 pop. Rock and Roll Music, which would be covered brilliantly later in a few years by the Beatles, #6 R&B and #8 pop. Sweet Little 16, #1 R&B, #2 pop. And of course, Berry's signature song, Johnny Be Good, #2 R&B, #8 pop. Not a single early rock and roll pioneer has been covered by more bands and artists than Chuck Berry. I mentioned the Beatles. They also covered Roll Over Beethoven. Who else covered Chuck Berry? Let's see. Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, Buddy Holly. Practically the half of the Rolling Stones' entire early repertoire is Chuck Berry songs.
Yep.
Jimi Hendrix. The Beach Boys stole the melody from Sweet Little 16 for Surfin' USA. Practically a cover. Electric Light Orchestra, AC/DC, Rod Stewart and the Faces, David Bowie, the Yardbirds, the Kinks, the Grateful Dead, Fish. They all covered Chuck Berry. The man is a god. Chris?
Yeah, he's, I think, the most singular genius in the history of rock and roll. And here's the incredible thing about Berry. He was in his 30s, his early 30s.
He was a late bloomer.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, he spent, I think, the good part of his 20s, I think, working in an auto factory. He's from St. Louis.
Yeah.
And so like St. Louis, East St. Louis, and he would cut his teeth in bands there. And I did a bunch of research. He did an interview with Neil Strauss and Rolling Stone in like 2010, and he did some stuff with Robert Hilburn in the LA Times back in the 80s. Basically, he didn't live any of the stuff he wrote about.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was just, he was just a perfectionist and a professional. It was just his professionalism. And he just had this talent. And it's like, okay, so, if I'm writing for young people, and there's this, and he said he chose rock and roll because that's where the money was.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's like, oh, okay. So, kids going to school, I'll write about school, or, cars, we'll do that. or, Rebellion. Okay. Young Love. Okay. Well, we'll do that. And he would do it. And so, and then not only that, but there's like a simple genius to him too. And so, like I think you said, he's like sort of the more countryish, the most countryish of these guys. That yeah, he incorporated boogie woogie, and a lot of his songs are 12-bar blues.
Yeah.
But they're so clever in the way that they use those 12 bars. He's got that kind of twang and kind of, like subtle wink, wink joy of country music. And I guess what it came out of is, he would go to these shows, he would perform these shows, and it'd be segregated audiences, all the blacks on the left and all the white kids on the right. And he was just kind of playing like, I have a chance to introduce folks. And so it was really showmanship where he would kind of mix in the country with the rhythm and blues, because then like the white kids are all vibing on the rhythm and blues and the black kids are all vibing on the country. And so it was just very simple stuff like that. And I also believe that Barry is the single best lyricist in the history of rock and roll, including Bob Dylan. Some of his stuff is just so brilliant and like it's economical, and it just the way he's able to fit it into his riffs and sort of his structure is remarkable. I mean, here's a couple of my favorites from his thing, because he was very clever and very subtle and very subversive. So here's a verse from the song "Brown-Eyed Handsome Man." Marlo Venus was a beautiful lass. She had the world in the palm of her hand. She lost both her arms in a wrestling match to meet a brown-eyed handsome man. She fought and won herself a brown-eyed handsome man, which essentially is him. Yeah. And then from Beautiful Delilah, which is a wonderful story song. And it's kind of it's a really kind of a great punchline, or it's like a setup for a joke. Like each verse is a setup for the same joke, where he says, "Beautiful Delilah bathing in the sun, an audience of 17, and notice not a one. Local Casanova who wouldn't be outdone. Let her steal his heart away, break it just for fun." And then, of course, "Rebecca, don't allow me to fool around with you. You are so tantalizing, you just can't be true." Yeah. So I just think just kind of funny that he's like rejecting Rebecca to get at Delilah. Yeah. And so, but that was the kind of stuff he did. And like you said, he was a storyteller, and like even like Maybelline, Maybelline is a country song.
Yeah.
I mean, just pure and simple. But but even Barry, obviously, he also had the showmanship. So he was a professional in terms of his songwriting, genius as a guitar player. Obviously, John Lennon, basically his guitar playing style was just Chuck Berry, pure and simple.
Yeah.
2 strings over the top, and it was just, it was basically just, and Keith Richards, obviously, hugely influenced by Barry, but the showmanship too, where he would go out there in those ridiculous outfits with the, the pink shirts with the black bolos, and, with the greased up kind of conch hair, and, obviously most famous for the duck walk. Mm-hmm. And, all that kind of stuff. And then as he, when he started performing in the 70s, he had those ridiculous outfits where he would have the blue blazer and the captain's hat.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. And then like his sense of humor kept like getting sharper. I don't know. Have you heard this? He had a album in 1968 called Concerto in B Good. And the song Concerto in B Good is basically like 17-minute. It's like the same rhythm, but him just jamming to this like electronic rhythm. It's really just kind of fascinating. And yeah, he had his peccadillos. He had his legal issues, which I'm sure you'll talk about in a second, in terms of getting in trouble, messing around with overly young women.
Yeah.
He's a complicated guy. He's known for being really, really prickly. Keith Richards quote that I found that says, "I love his work, but I couldn't warm to him even if I was cremated next to him." which is really funny. And
also, I mean, he in his book, Keith Richards, in his autobiography, his memoir, he mentions that the reason Chuck Berry was so prickly and such a kind of a dick to some people is that he came up in an era where white concert promoters would screw artists over all
Oh
the
yeah.
freaking time.
Oh, and he
And
says that in that Hilburn interview that he just
yeah,
like learned to be distrustful early.
right. And like to the point where Berry became famous for like being paid in cash up front.
Yep.
You can trust me to come up and play more than I can trust you to pay me. That's kind of like
Yeah.
his mentality. Yeah. So that in one ways is understandable, but he's also he's had his problems, with the law. Like I said, you mentioned the whole thing. We'll mention it in the next episode. Is one of the signifiers of the death of this early phase of rock and roll was him getting busted having a relationship with a 14-year-old girl and crossing her, going across state lines.
Yep. The Mann Act.
Yeah,
Yep.
which is stupid law. But anyway, he got busted for that. He also got in trouble when his house got raided and they found videotapes of women, one of whom was a minor. In this raid, they also found marijuana. So he got brought up on felony drug and child abuse charges. The child abuse charges were dropped, but he pled guilty to the marijuana. Later, like I think maybe like toward the end of his life, there were videos that surfaced, videos of Chuck Berry urinating on a woman and another of a woman defecating on him. He was into some
Yummy.
kinky shit.
Yeah, and I can't verify this, but there's another story too. Apparently, he owned a club in St. Louis that
yeah,
where he equipped the women's bathroom stalls with cameras so he could watch them taking a tinkle.
He was into shit and piss stuff. It's weird, man.
Yeah,
This guy was
he definitely had those things, and
Well, maybe he always was a freaky deaky guy, but the fame gave him the excuse and the avenue to do it, to indulge in it.
Right? Oh yeah, and again, he also had this thing too that he, I think he was a dropout, a high school dropout, but he had to like prove, like he had this thing about proving that he was the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah.
And so really well read. And that's why his lyrics, they have that economy, but they also have this literateness to them as well. Right. So Berry, like those other guys that we mentioned, they had, they were formative and they had their own input. But Berry, man, he, in the dictionary under rock and roll, it's Chuck Berry doing the duck walk.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, really is. I mean, plain and simple. And so, yeah, those guys are the forebearers of rock and roll. Those four guys: Fats, Little Richard, Bo Diddley, and Chuck Berry. On Chuck Berry, by the way, the album that the essential starting point is The Great 28, which is up there with Star Time as probably the greatest comp record of all time.
Yeah, it's basically got it's basically the Great 28, Chuck Berry's 28 best songs, basically.
Yeah, I mean, not quite. I mean, like you never can tell was not on there, and there's a few others, but these were all before he did My Ding-a-Ling. Interestingly enough, My Ding-a-Ling is 1972. That's his biggest hit.
His number one hit, number one pop. Yeah. A song about his cock went number one.
Yes, in 1972, that was his biggest hit. But anyway, God bless you, Chuck, and God bless, hail, hail, rock and roll.
Yes, and our next episode will be part 2 and the final episode of this very mini series, the first golden age of rock. And basically, what we're going to talk about is rock crossing over to the mainstream, i.e., white people getting into it, and the other, some other great rock and roll artists of this time period, how it crossed over to the mainstream, how it happened, what happened, and then how it seemingly died for a little while. It will come back to life later on in the 1960s, thanks to these 4 guys from Liverpool, England, who would, resurrect it. But in the meantime, it crossed over to the mainstream, how it seemingly died, what happened, and the legacy of basically basically the white mainstream appropriating black music. So that's what we're going to touch on into the next episode. And with that, folks, rock on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as we always end these episodes with, yes, definitely. If you agree with anything we said, disagree with anything you said, if we went on a little too strongly, hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. You can visit us on Twitter. We've been pretty active up there lately. Our handle is @curmudgeonpod. Although maybe we could get an $8 blue check mark, and then there'll be 20 other Curmudgeon Pod accounts too. I don't know if you read about that, but that's a thing now because of Elon Musk. And then finally, we would love you to join our Facebook community, the Curmudgeonly community on Facebook. We've got some pretty loyal members there. Facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. We're there. And then also we'll be making a Spotify playlist and then putting that up there for this episode as well. Excited about that because it's going to be probably about the best mix we've made to date. So